everyone, welcome back. So today we are talking about why it's important to limit the number of projects and tasks that we're working on at any given time. Next week we're going to start breaking down our goals into projects and tasks, but before we got there, I think it's important to talk about limiting ourselves. I think many of us, myself included, tend to overindulge at the project and task buffet. I'm extremely optimistic about the amount that I can accomplish at any given time if I'm not careful. I forget about my fluctuating energy levels, the periods of low energy I call my I don't wannas. I forget about waiting for others for certain parts. I forget about things I've already committed to. And considering all of that, I agree with Charlie Gilkey when he says that we need to limit ourselves to 5 active projects at any time. Now, when I say 5 active projects, I'm talking about 5 at each level. So that's 5 quarterly, 5 monthly, 5 weekly, and maybe even 5 daily. That's not to say that you don't have a waiting list of projects to work on, but 5 of them that you're actively pushing forward at any given time. When I work from the Power Sheets goal setting, I end up with 8 annual goals, and that's fine. When I set them, I acknowledge that 3 of them are going to be in a waiting for or on hold status at any given time. All right, so let's talk about how you choose your 5. Believe it or not, you're not starting with your goal or project lists. The first thing to do is stop and think about any major life events or situations that are going on right now for you. And these are things that are taking your time, energy, and attention. So some examples: being a new parent, dealing with a major illness, or in this case pandemic, moving, dealing with legal issues, caring for someone else, maybe a parent, a partner, a spouse, or maybe some major volunteer role that you've taken on. All of these are projects in and of themselves, even though we don't always think of them that way. So if you don't include them, you're going to find yourself overwhelmed from the start. They may or may not be long-term, so you're going to want to take into consideration the length of time that you're committed as well. In fact, I usually mark down what I think the time frame is going to be when I list these out, which kind of helps me judge what my capacity is going to be later on. So after you've acknowledged the thus far unacknowledged projects that you have going on right now, it's time to look at your actual list of projects. If you have a large list of projects that you know are projects, but maybe haven't really evaluated yet, I would start by estimating the amount of time that you think each one of them is going to take. So keep in mind, you may have started them already, so if that's the case, look at the amount of time you think it'll take to complete them. Do you think they'll take a day to complete, a week, a month, a quarter, a year, more than a year? My advice, be generous with your estimate. If it's going to take a couple of days, round up to a week. If you think it's going to take a couple of weeks, round up to a month. We all know we're overly optimistic when we're estimating times, so it's better to have the win of finishing sooner rather than the frustration of having a project go longer than you thought it was going to. As you go, mark however you need to so that you remember the time frame you've associated with it. You could use M for month, W for week, Q for quarter, Y for year. Maybe you like to doodle, so you assign some sort of symbol. Whatever you need to do to indicate to yourself so you don't forget. So if you use a doodle, make sure you use a key in case you forget later on, but make sure you mark down a way that you will remember later on how long do you think something is going to take. All right, so now that you have your list marked by time frame, it's time to prioritize. There's so many ways to do this. Some of them are arbitrary, some of them are not, but I'm just going to give you a few examples. So some people use something called the Eisenhower matrix. Essentially, there are 4 quadrants, and it's a combination of urgency and importance. So quadrant 1 is urgent and important. Quadrant 2 is important but not urgent. Quadrant 3 is urgent but it's not important. And quadrant 4 is neither important nor urgent. So some people use the first priority, second priority, third priority. Now this might be more arbitrary in considering what priority it is to you, or commitments like work. So within that, you could have multiple things that are at the same level of priority. You can also use the same sort of a system with a comparison. So this thing is the most important thing, so I'm going to rate it first priority. This is not as important, so I'm going to rate it second. So, but then others just look at each item on its own and decide kind of its own independent priority. The Franklin-Covey system uses letters and numbers, so A, B, C, D, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So you will have some items with the priority of A, and then within that priority you rank things. So you end up with A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, C1, C2. So whatever works for you though, use that. The important thing is to end up with a prioritized list. If there's a due date, make sure that you have that written down also, because that is going to play into priority. The closer you get to the due date, the more important it's probably going to be. So keep in mind your priorities will probably change. These are not like, I've said it, it's done. Every time you reevaluate this, you want to make sure nothing has moved up in the priority list. Sometimes something becomes more important to you. Sometimes other people think it's more important to them. So it'll change though. That's the important part. So now that you have your list prioritized, let's talk about deciding what to do. So you'll want to make sure that you're taking into account not just what is latest and loudest, but also what will move you closer to accomplishing your goals. So let's start with making your list using the top-down method. In this method, you'll take your top 5 annual goals and then you'll break them down into quarterly projects. As you do that, you'll evaluate them next to the other quarterly projects. Remember, you had the list of projects that you think will take a quarter. So you'll evaluate the priority of those. What things do I need to do to move my goals forward versus what other projects do I have going on that are about that quarterly level? So of that group, you'll then choose your top 5 quarterly projects. So then you take those quarterly projects, you'll break them down into monthly projects, and again, choose your top 5, but also taking into account the other projects you have that you think will take you about a month. Again, obviously you're not just working with just your goals, but keep in mind these other projects that you've committed to, or say that you've wanted to commit to as well. So you'll continue moving down the levels until you get to the daily level. So the idea is that you're making sure that all of your projects are moving forward, obviously starting with the ones that are most important, by including your higher level in your consideration of what you're working on. So there's also a way to look at this from a slightly different direction. I wouldn't advise starting at the daily level because that's probably what you're doing already and it probably isn't working. You're just looking at what's important to me today, but not thinking about next week, next month, next quarter, next year. Instead, what you're doing is working reactively on whatever shows up and is the loudest. So looking at the monthly level is probably a good place to start if you don't want to start at the annual level. Most people have a pretty good idea of what's going on in the next 30 days. So it's easier to plan within that time frame, especially if you're new to this. So once again, you're looking at your monthly projects based on priority. If you have some space in your list, maybe see if there's any progress that you can make towards your annual or quarterly goals. So within your 5 monthly projects, figure out what you need to do in week-sized chunks in order to move them forward. So definitely schedule out the next week. But if you have an idea of what you need to work on in week-sized pieces, and you have an idea of what's going on that week, you can go ahead and schedule those out, just so you have an idea looking forward about when you want to reserve time. This is especially important if you know you have like a built-in amount of waiting time. So if I've submitted something and I know it's going to take me 30 days to get it back, I'll probably want to kind of pre-schedule that next step 30 days out. So looking at the top-down level or the mid-level, whatever you want to do, it's really up to you whichever one makes the most sense to you. Again, it also has to do with how familiar you are with this, how comfortable you are with working at higher levels. If you're brand new, sometimes it's easier to start kind of at the month. And then as you become more comfortable with that and have an idea of how long things take, then you can bump yourself up to the quarterly level and start there. All right, so breaking things down is all well and good, but why just 5? And that was a question I asked too. Why 5? Why not 6? Why not 7? So while I'd love to think that all that I'm doing is working on my task and to-do lists, I know that's not the case. I have appointments, I have phone calls, I have emails to return, friends to visit, family to see, conversations to have, managing to do, meals with friends, date nights, last-minute requests, all of that. The list goes on. So limiting myself to 5 at any given level makes sure that I have a solid chance of actually working on those 5 amongst all the other things that I'm doing at the same time as a part of life. So, and sometimes the stars align and I actually get all 5 things done and I have time left over. And I'll be honest, that doesn't happen very often. Usually I'm still optimistic about it all. But you have that prioritized waiting list ready for you, so then all you have to do is just go look and see what is the next thing that I thought was important that I needed to do. So you already have a waiting list ready for you. Now that being said, sometimes I need to take what I call a brain break. I am just mentally exhausted and I just can't handle anything that maybe it's really important, but it takes a lot of like mental capacity to handle. So part of having balance is knowing that you're going to have cycles of high and low productivity, and that's natural. Acknowledging and building that in can keep you from getting frustrated, overwhelmed, and burnt out. We're not 100% productive 100% of the time. That's just not realistic. So if you know you have a week of high intensity meetings, so it's a good idea to schedule tasks or projects around that time that kind of give yourself an emotional or intellectual break. If you can find a way to move projects forward at the same time, that's a bonus. But productivity isn't the goal of life. I mean, we don't have value because of what we do. We have value because of who we are. All right. So the next few videos in the series are going to get into the nuts and bolts of what I know you guys have been waiting for, which is breaking down goals and getting them all the way down to the task level, which is pretty much how you get things going and how you get things accomplished. It's one little step at a time. So for the next few weeks, we're going to be spending some time in overhead view. If you have any projects or goals that you would like to see me use an example, please leave them down below in the comments. And if you have any extra information that I need to know about, like time frame, when they're due, that sort of thing, go ahead and include that information as well. Otherwise, I'll be working off of some of my own personal goals and some random things that I might just pick up that are fairly generic. But if you have something specific you'd like to see me work on, I would be happy to do that for you. So again, leave those down below in the comments. So if you're just jumping in, this is the first video you've seen. We're probably a couple months into this. I'm posting these once a week, so I will link that playlist up above in the cards and then also down below in the description box. If you have any questions or comments that this video didn't answer or the other videos didn't answer, go ahead and leave them in the comments below. I'll be happy to either touch on them and answer it quickly, or hey, it might actually spawn a topic for a new video, or I'll make sure I cover it in an upcoming video if it's something I'm going to be covering. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this was helpful. I will see you in the next one. Bye!